So now I'll be introducing Dr. Sari van Anders. Dr. van Anders is an associate professor of women's studies and psychology. Her research has been consistently honored with national awards. She's published over 50 papers on hormones and intimacy in social context, combining feminist science, social neuroendocrinology, health, gender and sex, and sexual diversity. Dr. van Anders sits on 4 editorial boards. She's not only a scientist, she's an activist and a tireless educator about sexual health. She's generous with her time and wisdom, an invaluable part of our greater community. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sari van Anders. Green. Not yet. Just one.
Oh, just one. I'm just turning it on and off.
And if you need this, you can.
Okay. Is this working? Oh, awesome. I am. Thank you. So I just want to let you know that I am in the middle of my 2nd trimester and still extremely pregnancy nauseous for any of you who had the fun of that. So I have like brownies and drinks, and I might have to stop and stuff my face for a while, so please excuse me, and I'll try to be as dynamic as possible, but I only started leaving my house after 3 months last week. So, yeah, pregnancy, it's the best. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. It's a real delight to be here. I got to be here last year, and I saw Debbie Herbenek give a talk, which was just a really wonderful and fascinating talk. So it's a real delight to be here and be able to talk to you about testosterone, sexuality, and gender sex. And I've tried to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions, and hopefully that will happen. I feel like a lot of times what we hear about testosterone in the media, about testosterone and sexuality, is a really limited focus that is pretty biologically deterministic. So we don't have a lot of social context. We don't have a lot of gender and sex and sexual diversity. And my hope is to be able to present you with some of the other research that's going on that might give you a different view. Let me just sugar up. So today I'm just going to tell you a bit about my research program. I'm going to talk about 2 lines of research that have to do with intimacy, gender, sex, and testosterone. I'll give you some framing and introduction for that, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of my work on cuddling and some of my work on sexual desire, and then leave you with some conclusions. So moving into my research program, with hormones and behavior, traditionally people have been interested in the effects of hormones on behavior. More contemporarily, we're interested in this sort of iterative or reverse relationship, not only how hormones affect behavior, but also how behavior affects hormones. My research is in a field that I call social neuroendocrinology, and I think of it as even more sort of complicated and nuanced than just adding another arrow. So first of all, we think of hormones and behavior as an iterative process, and when we look at adults, for example, we don't know what stage we got to. Let's say an adult has a hormone level of X. I don't know how they got to that hormone level. It could have been genetics, it could have been other hormonal influences, it could have been a lived experience, could have been a certain diet, and so on. Now, we don't happen to have a laser. I can just point up here, probably. Look at, I'm so talented. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about is how these hormone behavior associations are happening in 2 sort of conjoint spaces. One of them is social context, right? So all human behavior is happening in a socialized system. People are subject to social norms, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And hormones can only respond and act in ways they've been evolved to do. We can also condition them and so on. But this is always happening in a situation that is both social context and evolution kind of at the same time. Now, I'm really interested in what I call gender sex, and I put those 2 together because when we're looking at adults, very rarely do we know whether we're talking about sex, which is like femaleness, maleness, and sex diversity, those sort of evolved biological characteristics. And we very rarely do we know whether we're only talking about gender, which is socialized aspects of gender diversity, femininity, and masculinity. Usually we're talking about whole people. We're talking about women, men, and gender diverse people. So we're really talking about a place where all that comes together. And almost none of our studies are actually designed to disentangle those. So I use gender sex as a shorthand to remind us that we're talking about a space that is simultaneously social context and evolved. Now, with social context, as I said, we can think of things like social norms. We can think of things like socialization, right? We all come to know that right now it's maybe appropriate to sit and not have a dance party, right? We come to understand the social norms of our situation. Although dance parties are pretty awesome, so I might forgive you. We understand and we get sorted, sometimes as a part of our socialization, sometimes kind of without our permission, into social groups. And we also come to understand social constructions, so sort of concepts that we all agree to hold as true, but might differ by culture. Now, social context overlaps with what we would call gender. And I think of sex as overlapping with what we call evolution. And then gender sex is, again, this space where we're actually studying hormone behavior associations, where we're studying whole people. Now, I want to move into talking about testosterone because that's a hormone I'll be discussing, and give you a bit of background. Testosterone is a steroid hormone. It's evolutionarily constrained, meaning as I said before, it can only do the things it was evolved to do. It does kind of the same thing across species, although with species-specific considerations. It does the same thing in women and men and gender-diverse people. Where it comes from, it can actually come from precursors from the adrenal gland, which you might better know as the stress gland, which releases cortisol. But it also releases some testosterone precursors, like things that turn into testosterone. It's also released from the gonads, the ovaries and the testes, and sometimes people don't actually realize that it's naturally present in women's bodies, not just men's. It's higher in men than women on average. And heritability estimates range from about 41 to 66%. And what that means is researchers tend to think that the genetic contribution to any person's testosterone levels is, let's say, about half. So half is genetic and half is environmental. And I want to tell you that that's probably a huge overestimate of the genetic contributions, because what happens is in those studies is a lot of social context is held constant and doesn't vary, which would account for much more variability if we allowed it to vary. Now, these are kind of small screens, so I'm not sure how well you can see them. You might be able to see some glistening pectoral muscles or some sort of scientific-looking, medico-scientific-looking diagrams. One of the goals of my research is redefining testosterone beyond masculinity. So we have a cultural idea that testosterone is tied to masculinity, and I don't think the scientific evidence supports that. And I'm going to tell you why throughout my talk. Now, this is a Google image search, and I like to use Google image searches because I think they give us an idea into something that scholars call the public imaginary. Like, what are people thinking? What kind of images do they have in their head when they're thinking of a concept? So anyone can do this. Sometimes you want to be careful where your doors open. I've Google image searched many things for teaching. I teach a course on sexuality and science, and as you know, if you Google image search labia or something like that, not everything you want to see comes up, unfortunately. Some really disturbing things come up sometimes, eh? Like, it's funny to joke about, but some of them are actually truly worrisome. Anyway. And then all the good educational stuff is you have to Google sign in with that Google age thing. It's really problematic. Anyway, you all know a lot more about that than me as therapist educators. So some of the things we can notice is that this is this is focusing on men, very specific ideas about masculinity and maleness. The women are present kind of by boobs. I don't know if you can see that. Medicine, people are trying to boost their testosterone, right? Not many people are trying to decrease it. So we can see some cultural anxieties about low testosterone. And you might also notice how white people are. And that's actually a big problem whenever you do Google image search. And probably if you search through any images in any magazine, which is in most magazines, which is really disturbing. And so I'd like to point that out because I don't want people to think that the whole world is only thinking about white people, just on Google image search. So as I said, a lot of my research is on redefining the role of testosterone beyond masculinity. And I didn't actually come to that as the goal of my research. I was always interested in feminist science, but I certainly never thought that there would be an opportunity or a reason to disentangle testosterone from masculinity, because to me, as probably to many of you, those two seemed actually pretty reliably connected. So one of the things I talk about is something called a pre-theory model. And pre-theory is sort of like a fancy feminist philosophy word for talking about just cultural assumptions. And it's kind of like scientists are supposed to base their research on theory. But how do you ask questions before you actually have a formal theory? People do that all the time. Scientists are often curious about testing how variable A and variable X are linked. And they're going to do that whether they have theory or not. But how do they even come to ask whether those two things are linked? And we call that pre-theory. And the pre-theory model of testosterone is that it's positively linked to masculinity as a sort of a concept. And the exemplars of masculinity include things like aggression, mating, sexuality, and challenge. And then we tend to think that it's inversely related to femininity, and then sort of the behavioral exemplar of that ends up being things to do with parenting. And this is not very often articulated, right? So people don't lay this out. Here's my theory of testosterone. I'm going to go test it. This is sort of the assumptions that drive why people are looking at these ones and why sexuality comes up so often. But evidence is actually all over the place. So as you can see, aggression is actually not really linked to testosterone at all in humans. There's been so many researchers trying to show it, and they keep showing basically that it's not. Sexuality, depending, can be linked to low or high testosterone. I'm going to talk about some of that. And challenge is linked to high testosterone generally, but again, it's mixed. Parenting can be mixed to both. So it doesn't really seem like a useful or worthwhile framework. So instead, one of the things I provided is this new framework for thinking of testosterone as instead of having sort of a container of masculinity and femininity to sort out associations, to think about competition and nurturance. And you might think, that sounds like overlaps for masculinity and femininity. But I really don't mean it that way. I mean it in humans, in women, and men, and gender-diverse people. So I'm going to spell out what that means in a little more detail for you. So in this theory, we're just going to call it the SP theory. What we think is that high testosterone is linked to competition, or competition increases testosterone. And competition is defined as acquiring or keeping resources. And the main thing for our purposes is that can involve like erotic experiences. So things like orgasm, genital pleasure, things that have to do with sort of what we sort of stereotypically think of as sexuality. But of course, I think as sex therapists and sex educators, we know sexuality involves a lot more than just eroticism. But for here, the erotic part. We think of nurturance decreasing testosterone, and nurturance involving loving, warm contact. And that can be between partners, parents and offspring, parents and children, friends, pets. Well, maybe not pets with each other. I don't know. They sometimes get along. I've seen pictures on Facebook. There's always like a tiger and like a puppy or something, right? No? That sounds dangerous. And we can think of things like things that go on between pair bonds, comforting and huddling and cuddling, and so on. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as well. So you can see that, hopefully, that sexuality actually kind of has both sides, right? So we might not always know where to predict it would go. So I want to actually talk more about cuddling as sort of like a tricky case, whether we think of it as erotic or nurturant, and what the empirical research suggests it might be. Now, I got interested in cuddling because I thought it was a really great way to go through my research life and get tenure, because who doesn't want to be having an expert on cuddling on their faculty, right? That's the way to make money and get famous. So, and my partner's always like, my partner is the world's expert on cuddling, and because I published like 3 papers or something on it. But what happened is I was really interested in how sexual activity would modulate testosterone. And what this is showing is that, and this is penis-vagina intercourse in women, significantly increased testosterone from baseline, and it increased testosterone at a trend level compared to exercise. And we included exercise as a control for the physical activity and energy expenditure that accompanies penis-vagina intercourse for some people, right? And we included cuddling not because we thought it would show the same effects as intercourse, but because we thought of it as a control. It would control for the close physical intimacy, but be non-sexual, and weren't we smart? No one had controlled for that before, and we were patting ourselves on the back. And by we, I mean me. And it turns out that cuddling actually significantly increased testosterone too, and as you can see, really similarly to intercourse. If anything, a bigger effect, although it's not a significant difference. So we started to think, like, that's surprising. We would not think as a culture, our pre-theory would not lead us to think that cuddling would increase testosterone. So what's going on? When we think of this framework, we could ask ourselves, well, where does cuddling go? And I think as again, people who are interested in sex therapy, you have a pretty nuanced and sophisticated idea of what cuddling might involve, what its goals might be, what it can be used for, and so on. So I won't ask you, but if I ask most people, where do you think cuddling goes, and I hadn't shown you that testosterone data, I think most people would say, you know, it's a nurturant thing. Not to say you would all be like, no, there's no nurturance to it. I think we would all say cuddling is pretty nurturant. But I think here many of us might realize, well, there could be some eroticism to it, too, when you're cuddling with a partner. Sorry. Oh, maternity clothes are the worst. And I'm, like, not quite big enough. Like, you know what I mean? I'm in that intermediate. It's the worst. If someone send me websites of good maternity clothes. Okay. I can feel everything's jumbled up here. It's bad news. Okay. I know it. So if you're laughing at me, I know. Okay. So we started to think, okay, well, according to our pre-theory, it would go into nurturance. But according to testosterone, it would go into competition, right? And again, the term competition is probably not a great term to use outside of people who are thinking only in evolutionary terms. But if you just think of, like, competition again, like getting an erotic opportunity or getting an orgasm or things like that. But again, I can see that it's not the best suited term for right now. So if we look again at cuddling in the public imaginary, which I'm not sure how much you can see, but I'll just describe it to you. There's a lot of people cuddling, a lot of cats cuddling, mostly white people again. Everyone else is busy. And mostly straight couples. We assume they're couples. And people, you know, like, I won't say it's entirely unerotic, you know what I mean? But it's like people aren't, like, don't look like they're grinding or things like that. There's a lot of sleeping, so, and so on. So public imaginary of cuddling seems to be pretty nurturant, which goes with our pre-theory, right? That's what we think of when we think of cuddling. Oop, okay. But as I said, given the SP theory, I was curious, was cuddling also erotic? Does it also fall into this high T category? So if we think of these intimacies that are tricky and that they could kind of go either way, like if we wanted to ask ourselves, is this erotic or is this nurturant? There's lots of ways we can answer that question. If we're interested in hormones, that gives us also a way to answer that question. And we can use testosterone. So for example, we can use this theory to test a hormonal response to some event. We can classify that event. And then we can test that hypothesis via a convergent method. And what I mean by that is, okay, we found that cuddling increased testosterone. We think that an increase in testosterone represents an erotic categorization or classification. But we need to somehow come back and show that another way, right? Otherwise, it's just circular. If we say things that increase T are erotic, cuddling increased T, therefore it must be erotic, it's just kind of going in a circle. We need some other piece of evidence that confirms that or that converges with that. So we could say, okay, well, is cuddling erotic or also erotic in addition to being nurturant? But I also want to tell you one really interesting thing we found, which is because of the way our study was designed, we asked people to take hormone samples before and after. So it was all the same participants doing multiple activities, but like just one a night. So every Wednesday, let's say, they did one of the assigned activities, and we controlled for order and all that. Before dinner, they took a saliva sample. 15 minutes after the activity, they took a saliva sample. So we had a pre and post. So what I was showing you before was a percent change. So we were able to say their hormones changed from pre to post. This one is showing you the pre-activity. And what we saw is that the nights people knew they were going to have intercourse, the women had higher T than cuddling or exercise. And what that, suggests to me is that there are anticipatory effects of intercourse on testosterone, but not cuddling. So anticipating you're going to engage in cuddling doesn't increase T, but engaging in cuddling does. So that made me think, okay, well, maybe cuddling is experienced as erotic, but perceived as nurturant. So when you're thinking about engaging in activity that you think of as nurturant, that doesn't increase your T. But when you actually engage in the activity that actually does involve some nurturance, but our stories about it, you know, might not have led us to expect that, then we do see an increase in T. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so since the study, this is an older study of mine, since the study, all the professional cuddling came about. So these were couples.
Okay, I can see in couples cuddling how the testosterone can rise because, you know.
Yeah, the professional cuddling.
The guys are cuddling, they think eventually they're going to bring it on, you know.
Well, so I'm going to tell you more about that, okay? But definitely I think the professional cuddlers are also a really fascinating phenomenon, the cuddling parties and things like that. There are cuddlers for hire. I think especially in like New York City or Toronto, some of the bigger cities. So you can hire someone, kind of like you can hire a sex worker, you could hire a cuddling worker. I don't think they call themselves cuddling workers. But, and then there's also like cuddling parties, like the idea of, I don't know, Tupperware parties, but with cuddling. And no Tupperware. I've not been to one, so I can't describe it. Perhaps in the question period, if someone has and is comfortable, they can tell us.
So New Jersey just passed a law that it's legal.
Okay, so New Jersey also, hot spot. There you go. Okay. I don't want to get too off, but one last quick one. Yes, this is salivary. No, but other people have, and they're highly correlated. Okay, so coming back, we actually then did a huge phenomenological study of cuddling because, surprise, things that we think of as stereotypically feminine often haven't been very well characterized in the literature. So basically no one had really ever studied cuddling between partners, which kind of sounds amazing considering how much many people love to cuddle and how much a part of people's lives it is. So what we found is that people perceive cuddling, as we hypothesized, as basically nurturant and non-erotic, and as our pre-theory assumptions would also tell us. So sexuality was rarely mentioned spontaneously, like it didn't come up if we didn't ask about sexuality, it didn't come up. Instead, themes that had to do with love, closeness, and bonding came up. So I want to show you what that looked like. We did some qualitative coding of data, and then we did some thematic organization of that. When we asked people why they cuddled, you can see that most people said reasons that fall into that nurturant category: love, closeness, safety, comfort, affection. And sex did come up, but it was like not common. It was the least common answer. So very few people are like, wow, when I think of cuddling, my mind jumps to sex. So after this talk, when we ask people to describe their feelings during cuddling, again, you can see that it's like no one says like horny or desire. People say things, again, that fall into that nurturing category: love, feeling bonded, and that's not S&M bonded, feeling good. Feeling good is maybe the closest you could get, but still kind of following along with the other themes seem to be more sort of feeling good and warm. But when we talked about the experiences, then it looked a little different. Cuddling was experienced as erotic. So, for example, people expect sexuality to follow cuddling. Cuddling is ranked as sexually arousing to most people, and I'll show you some of those data. And also cuddling is nude or partially nude for the majority of people, which for some reason to me was like, that was like ding, 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 but it doesn't have to be. For the nudists, maybe it doesn't matter. So, for example, we asked them, when you engage in sexual activity, does it start with cuddling? And the majority of people say yes, 75%. When we ask how sexually arousing cuddling is, you can see that the majority of people say at least somewhat sexually arousing. Here, I don't know how well you can see this, so I'll sort of take you through it. We also asked a whole bunch of questions about sexual experiences, dyadic and a little bit solitary too. What these are showing, number of nights and mornings cuddled, I think something like in the last week, I can't remember, how nurtured or protective they felt, how much they enjoyed cuddling, how relaxing or peaceful it was. And then we also asked all sorts of questions about how sexually attractive people felt, how frequently they engaged in sexual activity with a partner, how much they enjoyed it, and I'll get to that last column in a second. And what you can see is actually like a uniformly practically significant, that's what these asterisks are showing you, significant correlations between the dyadic sexual or partnered sexual measures and the cuddling measures, the partner cuddling measures. So there's actually a lot of overlap. Now you can see frequency of masturbation, which is that last sort of grayed out column that I'm graying out because I'm like, it's interesting, but don't pay too much attention to it, shows actually a fair number of significant but negative correlations, meaning that, let's say, the more frequently someone cuddled, well, that's a bad example. Let's see. The more relaxing, or the more positive they felt about cuddling, the less frequently they masturbated. And one of the things with my research that will come up when I talk about sexual desire is how different solitary and dyadic sexuality really are. People tend to think of them as sort of the same minus a partner, but they're really phenomenologically quite different. There's some overlap, but they're also different, if that makes sense. So this told me that dyadic and partnered sexual activity overlaps a lot with cuddling. It's more erotic than we had thought. So we think now that partner cuddling involves eroticism, and of course we're talking about, consensual partners. The people who volunteer for my studies are unlikely to be experiencing spousal abuse or things like that. These are usually people with pretty healthy sexual lives and healthy relationships. But we can think of partner cuddling as falling into this high T category, both because it increases testosterone and because we have convergent evidence suggesting it's actually experienced as relatively erotic. But again, context matters. So depending on who you're cuddling with, depending on what your culture thinks about cuddling, depending on all sorts of factors, cuddling might not be experienced that way. So we're not saying it's uniformly erotic, but that it can be. So now I want to move to sexual desire, which I've spent, I guess, now about a decade studying. And again, I want to talk about our pre-theory. And remember, pre-theory is those assumptions we have that we actually don't usually spell out, but they sort of drive our research and drive the way we approach things or think about them. So sexual desire, we tend to think of, and again, I don't necessarily include people in this room who usually have pretty nuanced views on this, but we tend to think that sexual desire is focused on experiencing orgasm or at least genital and erotic pleasure. When we talk about sexual desire, we typically mean it in a dyadic way, right? And then maybe solitary is folded in because it's kind of the same thing. We tend to think of it as unitary. And by that I mean we tend to think that sexual desire is the same thing, the same one thing, experienced in the same way by all people. So by that I mean we might think some people have high or low desire, but everyone is like high or low on the same measure of desire. We don't really think of like this person has desire A, this person has desire X, right? Everyone has desire A, and they're either high or low on A. We tend to think that sexual desire reflects an inner drive. Of course, there's been a lot of research that you probably know or will learn about suggesting that desire can be triggered and responsive and not just spontaneous. But the majority of people still think of it as spontaneous, as resulting from some inner drive. That inner drive we think of usually as sort of biohormonal, usually high testosterone, usually in some way overlapping with masculinity. So we tend to think men have much higher desire than women because they have higher testosterone than women. And we tend to think that socialization only tempers or enhances, right? Like people have desire, and maybe we can sort of tamp it down sometimes, or we can give opportunity for it to be expressed sometimes, but that's the only way socialization matters. So these are all the pre-theory assumptions, and once I got tenure, I thought I would read a book on how to write scientific articles. It seemed like a really good idea. And they were like, oh, make sure you give people the idea of where you're going, and if you ask a question, it should be obvious that you're going to answer it. So I'm going to cross these all out, just so you know. That's my foreshadowing. There's something about giving a talk. I don't know if it's the adrenaline that makes the nausea go away a little bit. So all I have to do is give a talk 24/7 until the nausea is done. I have like a YouTube channel. I'll just be talking all night. Okay. So these data that I'm going to show you are in women, and the reason is that the testosterone and desire correlations are only interesting in women. And the reason for that is there are no correlations in men between testosterone and desire. I've shown that a bunch of times. Other people have shown it a bunch of times. Basically, no one has shown any significant correlations between testosterone and desire in men who are not hypogonadal. So I just want to tell you that because that's one of those pre-theory things we all know. that actually isn't supported by any empirical evidence. So, okay, so what this is showing here, these are the women. This is testosterone levels. This is dyadic sexual desire, and I'm using the sexual desire inventory by Spector et al. And it's nice because it resolves into a dyadic and a solitary subscale, whereas a lot of desire questions are either just how much desire do you have, and they don't really define it. It's not perfect, but it has some nice features to it. And if you're noticing, what this is showing is a negative correlation, if you took psychology in undergrad and that sort of thing, which is not what we would expect, right? That's definitely not what our pre-theory tells us, that higher testosterone would be linked with lower dyadic sexual desire. I'm going to talk a lot about why that is. But I also want to tell you that this is not the first time. I found this before, and many others have. So again, our pre-theory tells us there's a certain clear picture. The data actually kind of, you know, they say, why let data ruin a good story? This is like one of those cases. I will tell you with the solitary desire, though, is that, and here's testosterone on the y-axis, no solitary desire, some solitary desire. Women with some solitary desire do have significantly higher testosterone than women with no solitary desire. And that is the direction we would expect. Now, I didn't do the scatter plot like that one, a correlation, because so many women, a third of women, and this is a predominantly younger college age, not exclusively, but younger college age population, and as you might know, many of them, surprisingly, I think it's surprising if you don't already know it, but again, I'm not sure. Surprisingly large number of college-age women are not masturbating and report low solitary desire. So 1/3 is actually roughly equivalent to what other people have found. But that's why I do that split. Otherwise, like everyone is right here, or a third of people. Good question. Great question. So dyadic desire is your desire to be sexual with another person. Solitary desire is desire to be sexual by yourself, for example, via masturbation. The men, there's no correlation at all between either. And there's about 10 studies showing that and none showing an association.
So when you go to the doctor and you're asking about sexual desire,
and they assume it's testosterone? Yeah, so that's why I'm really happy to be able to talk to you all. So, and we're going to go through that a lot. Yeah. The assumption that it's a biomedical cause and that it's testosterone, so I'm trying to think what time is, I think we're okay. Even the research on women with what used to be called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, the recent DSM has sexual arousal and interest disorder, I think. The women who would be diagnosed with HSDD, and I actually have an old study I did with Bill Fisher and some other people, those women don't have lower T than the women who don't have HSDD. So a difference in testosterone has never been the foundation. Which, you know, yeah, and let's talk about it more when, obviously I'm like, let's talk about it now. But let's talk about it more in the question period. Because that's a major point of my research. Oh. Yeah? Yes. This is correlational, so it's not cause and effect. That's right. Thanks for asking, and I'm sure other people had those questions too. Okay. So what this is showing, for those of you, you can just listen to me or you can look, depending on what your liking is of stats. What this is showing is a regression model. And one of the things with the study I did is, as you may or may not know, most hormone researchers who study desire are interested in hormonal causes of desire and influences. Most social researchers who study desire are interested in social influences on desire. And it's actually like never the twain shall meet. So there's basically no studies that people bring psychosocial factors into alongside biofactors. So often you get people arguing about which matter more, but it's sort of like you can't even have that argument because they're not in the same study, right? So what we did is we had all sorts of questions. It's certainly not a perfect study, none is, but we had about, I don't know, 20 to 30 more measures than anyone else. That always sounds, and then we're the best. Now I should have a medal. But I am actually really proud of this because we had all sorts of measures. We had measures like body image. We had measures like stress. We had measures like sexual activity. We had measures, social support, all sorts of different mood, all sorts of different measures. So we can actually pit them against each other statistically and see what accounts for more variance in the desire, right? Is it testosterone? Is it mood? Is it self-image? Right? All sorts of things we might be able to think about. And what, again, this is the women, because in the men, actually, I think in the men, we didn't find any significant predictors. I'm trying to remember. Definitely not testosterone. What this is showing is we had two models that were significant. And one of the models only had masturbation, was a big significant predictor of desire. Now, this sounds like I'm talking about cause and effect, actually, and the statistics presume you're talking about cause and effect, but it's still association. Okay, so when I say predictor, we didn't systematically vary. This isn't an experiment. Okay? The second model has both testosterone and masturbation and an interaction. So basically what this tells us, the take-home point of this slide is that masturbation is a pretty good predictor of desire, and testosterone might be one as well for women. Okay, but masturbation is actually a much clearer predictor. I also want to tell you, before I said that thing about how people assume men have higher testosterone, men have higher desire, and the reason men have higher desire is because they have higher testosterone. So people presume that from, feminist textbooks, actually, to behavioral neuroendocrinology textbooks, right? That's actually one of those pre-theory things that everyone's signed on to. No one's ever tested it. And what we show here is that, like everyone else, if you just look over here, here is solitary desire, here's men, here's women. No covariate means just measure of desire. Men do have reports higher solitary desire than women. And actually most studies, as far as I know, do show that. If you just take a measure of desire, men do score, on average, significantly higher than women. Here what we're doing is covarying testosterone. And what that means is we're actually trying to take out the shared variance of testosterone. And basically, if testosterone was accounting for the difference completely, these bars should be equal. And if it's accounting for some portion of the variance, the bars should be more equal than they are here. And as you can see, they're basically the same. There's still a significant difference, which tells us testosterone does not account for the gender-sex differences in sexual desire. Here, we tried covarying masturbation since masturbation was implicated earlier on, as I said. And what you can see is that when we covary masturbation, that tells us that masturbation seems to be accounting for the variance. Masturbation seems to be accounting for the gender-sex difference. So while people have been talking about these differences in desire as sex differences, evolved, biological, innate, fixed, I think that the evidence about masturbation tells us something much more complicated, interesting, and nuanced. That there's room for behavior to be affecting our desire, which again, I think for all of you is not really shocking, but for many people kind of is. And that things like masturbation might be. Again, this isn't a causal study, so we would need to do one to make those claims fully. But this evidence suggests that testosterone is not, right? And it suggests that masturbation is. Mm-hmm.
Shirley and I have a question.
Yeah.
She has two. I have a third one.
Okay.
Size of sample.
Mm-hmm.
Male, female partnership, and ages.
Great. So this is still the same study that had the primarily college-aged women, not exclusively. I think that there was at least 100 women, maybe 200. I have to go back and check. And your third question, were these primarily like heterosexual or people in same-sex or other sex relationships? So this probably actually mapped onto population norms. So we had a very small subset of people in same-sex relationships.
And were they all college students here? Or?
Yeah, here, but they weren't all. So we also recruited from the community. But for those of you who have ever done research, you know, when you recruit from the community in a college town, you primarily get college students. So yeah, so that's a big limitation, although interestingly, almost all the research on testosterone and sexual desire is done with postmenopausal women. So in contrast to the normal patterns of research, where everyone's looking at college-age samples, no one's looking at older women, this is actually one of the few studies to look at younger women. But, that's also just convenience for me. It's not like I was like, I'm like, I'll do what's easy. I didn't say that. If anyone's tweeting. Yes. So men reported more desire than women. But when we account for masturbation rates, that difference disappears. Does that make sense? But if we account for testosterone differences, it doesn't disappear. So that tells us masturbation accounts for the difference, most likely. Testosterone definitely does not.
The other thing is it depends on the time. That's why it could be a man maybe more.
Well, so that's that wouldn't explain this, but that is definitely a possibility to explain why we didn't see the correlations between testosterone and desire in men, except we controlled for all those things. So we control for time. So the question was, could the lack of correlation between testosterone and desire in men reflect other variation or noise that we didn't account for? Things like time of day, season, dietary habits, BMI, body mass index, things like that, that do co-vary with testosterone. And actually, I have a paper on measuring testosterone in sexuality research, so where we spell out all the things people need to measure but don't, and we do account for those things. So thanks for asking. Yes?
I think I probably know the answer, but I'm assuming obviously the people in this study, this grouping, are primarily healthy individuals.
Yes.
So has anybody looked at folks who are dealing with serious heart disease, whatever the case might be?
So in general, no, and we actually do specifically recruit for healthy individuals. For reasons having to do with we have to exclude people who are using hormonal altering medications. But the thing I will tell you, for example, if people have used testosterone as a supplement for men with HIV and who are taking drugs that also lower their sex drive and lower mood and all sorts of factors. And so people haven't done this sort of stuff, but they have looked at testosterone and desire in people with some compromised health, but not that broadly. Oh, and people have, with men who are hypogonadal or clinical groups of individuals, what testosterone treatment might do, but not in the same framework, I would say. And one interesting thing I just want to say is the research, one of the clearest effects of testosterone and desire, and this gets back to your question about the effects of testosterone supplementation. One of the clearest effects seems to be that testosterone treatment does improve sexual parameters in men who are hypogonadal, meaning their testes aren't producing much testosterone, among other things. But fascinatingly, when people actually started asking psychosocial questions, that effect seems to be mediated through depression, meaning that it's not actually testosterone directly on sexuality. It's testosterone improving depression parameters, which then improve sexual parameters. So one of the things I think to be wary of whenever you look at the testosterone literature, never mind, but is that rarely are those psychosocial variables measured, which could be mediators.
I guess what I'm harking back to is many not to cite any studies or all discussing with psychologists who are looking at women who experience libido after they finish their chemotherapy, and a lot of times they won't give them low levels of testosterone.
Yeah, testosterone is prescribed off-label all over, but I don't personally know of any cancer trials with it or even clinical reports, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. I've tried to focus more on healthy individuals because I'm not a clinical researcher, but people are definitely doing this off-label a lot. Okay, so one of the things we can ask about is where does desire fall? And again, our pre-theory and most of our assumptions would tell us desire falls in that erotic category. And if we look at this public imaginary again, very white, strawberries obviously fall into sexual desire. The ear, very detailed. But in general, right, it looks pretty erotic. So it's different, even when there's Even when there's couples, they're doing things that look more erotic than in the cuddling public imaginary. And so we would put desire into eroticism, but we could also maybe think, well, hey, things that are happening between couples also involve nurturance, right? And we know that. And one of the interesting things that you probably know already or will be learning, and maybe one of the reasons for many of your practices, is that for heterosexual women, dyadic sexual activity is not always the best way to experience orgasm. So orgasm rates with penis-vagina intercourse are not that high. I just saw a recent study come out showing that rates can be like lower than 2/3, right? Maybe above 50, but below 60%, depending on sexuality. And one of the things we started to think, well, when people have solitary desire, they're typically like, what do they want out of solitary desire? What's the goal? Usually, I think we could argue it might be orgasm, right? Not necessarily. Sometimes people just want to fall asleep. Sometimes they're bored, right? Who knows? But orgasm seems like a likely outcome. But dyadic desire, especially when your sexuality might not actually end up involving orgasm, the desire might not be for orgasm. So I am not saying that heterosexual women don't want orgasm, or that they necessarily have to want orgasm, or that they should want orgasm. Those are not things I'm saying. But what I am saying is that I think women are rational, heterosexual women, and if orgasm is not necessarily on the menu, maybe that's not what they're ordering. And so maybe they're interested in something nurturant, right? Again, I don't think women are naturally nurturant, but I think women are rational and might be wanting what they can have. And nurturance is a great thing, right? So what we did in another study that we're just revising now is look at desire as multifaceted. And what we did is we said, when you last experienced desire, I'm trying to remember the question, how strong was it for? And we had a whole bunch of possibilities. And I don't think that there's one way to measure desire right. I want to be clear. I think it's going to be situated and contextualized. What people want when they say they have high desire might be different in different cultures. So I don't think this is necessarily the right way, but I do think it gets at the point, which is that desire can be multifaceted. So what this is showing is we did something called factor analysis on our answers, and it shows very different types of desire, right? So this first one is emotional connectedness. And again, I think when people say, I have high desire to be with another person, high sexual desire, we don't necessarily think it's for emotional connectedness, although again, in this room, we probably know that. And some of the examples were desire to express love for a partner, make a partner feel emotionally closer. Erotic engagement, which maps on more to our pre-theory of desire, I think. So desire to experience orgasm or experience specific activities. Stress and sensation seeking, so desire to relieve stress. I think people know that, but I don't think people really consciously think about that when they're talking about desire. Control or conflict management, right? So last time you really wanted to have sex, why? To feel in control of a relationship, to avoid conflict with a partner, right? We didn't have this answer, but I'm always like, because it's Saturday night. Like, there's so many reasons people have desire, right? And then this last one, which sounds all hunky-dory, but is actually like this sort of like darker side, desire to please a partner and make a partner feel happy, which, like I said, sounds really good, but was more about kind of like feeling like, you know, that's what you have to do to maintain this relationship, as opposed to like, let's do that because it'll be fun. So what this is showing you is that there are different kinds of desires. We also looked at how some of the items were correlated with testosterone, and what this is showing is that as we sort of have theorized with our framework, the ones that had to do more with like erotic pleasure were positively correlated with testosterone. They were more erotic. The ones that were more nurturant were negatively correlated with testosterone. So again, different types of desires are going to show different types of associations with testosterone. We also asked about, we did some qualitative work, and I think that's exciting for bio research because usually it's like bio research, qualitative research, like they never talk to each other. But I think it's really important, and I'm a big convert. We asked about whether it's okay to experience solitary pleasure, whether it's okay to masturbate when you're in a relationship with another person. And the reason we asked about that is we started to get interested in why is, you know, as I've been saying, why are solitary and dyadic desires showing these opposite correlations with testosterone? Again, telling us they're different things, but also telling us they have different functions maybe. And we looked at women who were heterosexually identified and women who were lesbian, bisexual, and queer identified. And because of ends, our bisexual women could choose which group to go into, which is far from perfect to have to force bisexual women to be lumped in one way. So here's these are some responses from our youngest group and then our still quite young group. And these are different women. So is it okay to masturbate when you're in a relationship? Oh yeah, it better be. I think it's fine, hell yeah. And anyone that thinks it's not is no longer my boyfriend. And here's the response from our heterosexual women. And I want to be clear that we're not cherry-picking these responses. These responses reflected themes that came out. For me, it's, and she's talking about orgasm, by myself is easier, but I don't know, I'm married. And so being married, for me, changes things. Like, I almost feel like I'm cheating on my husband if I were to masturbate. I know that sounds kind of weird, but so I don't engage in that without, we assume she means him. So obviously, access to orgasm there's some sort of hetero problem, right, for some heterosexual women. We asked about dyadic sexual pleasure as well. And one of the things we started to think is that it's not just low desire, as I've been saying, that is correlated with low dyadic desire that's correlated with testosterone, but low hetero desire. So as this heterosexual woman says, that, and she's talking about orgasm, is just not an expectation at all for me in partnered sexuality. And I hope some of you are like, oh. Not that it has to be, right? Not that every sexual activity has to involve orgasm, or should, or that it needs to be a goal. And I call this the queer yeah response. So this woman says, I really do like to orgasm, though, and that's a big part of sex for me. Like, if I yeah, I haven't had any consistent partners that I don't orgasm with, and so that's pretty central for me, too. And I call that the yeah response because I think it's sort of like when I go to a restaurant and I order food, I expect to eat, but I'm not surprised when the food comes because what else would happen? And there's other things going on. We're talking. The food is part of it. It's not the only thing, but I like it. So I want to give you what I think is the main point of the research that I've been telling you on sexual desire. And just let me briefly say, it's not that queer, lesbian, bisexual women have no sexual problems, right? And that they're perfect and a perfect foil for heterosexual women at all, right? Obviously, different women from different sexual locations have, different relationalities to sexuality, and we need to respect that. But I think that one of the things I'm trying to explain is that desire is situated, right? Heterosexual women aren't experiencing desire outside the fact that they're heterosexual, and that they've been socialized to see their bodies, potentially someone else's property, their orgasms, right? I can't orgasm because I'm his, right, unless he's there. In a way that for many lesbian, bisexual, and queer women, they don't necessarily feel that, right? Desire is situated, and testosterone associations reflect that, which only makes sense. If there's different kinds of desire, they can't all be associated with testosterone in the same way. And I think also, I hope that this is somewhat convincing for you that a feminist lens, even for basic hormone questions like how is testosterone and desire associated, is so useful and necessary. Without this feminist lens, we had all this pre-theory, we had all this data, story data didn't match, and who cared, right? And we can use the SP theory to actually refine our understandings of sexual desire. So I'm moving into the closing. Here you go. I scratched it all out, like I said I would. So sexual desire empirically really contrasts with our pre-theory notions of sexual desire. So moving into our conclusions, we had a lot of questions during. We'll see how much I might be eating up. We'll see. I hope that my work has helped to redefine the social function of testosterone for you from beyond masculinity to thinking much more nuanced and within gender sex. I hope that it's convinced you of the importance of paying attention to gender and sexual diversity and paying attention to socialization. We rarely are going to hear the word social construction or socialization when we do hormone work, but without it, we really can't know what we're even studying, right? Because sexuality is in part a social construction, meaning it's going to be experienced in ways that are situated. Hopefully I've convinced you of the utility of feminist science, of bringing feminism and bioscience together. And I also want to say often we get worried about biowork as being really reductionist, meaning it takes the richness out of the equation, like we lose all that. And I hope that what you've seen is that actually by bringing testosterone in, we kind of exploded things, right? We started out with one desire. Now we have all sorts of desires. We started out with like this clear story about cuddling. Now we're like, well, maybe it depends on context and experience, perception, activity, so on. So I think of testosterone and biomeasures as sort of giving us this rich explosion rather than like a reduction. As I told you, I think partner cuddling, we can think about perceptions of an activity versus experiences of it as being very different, both mattering equally, right? Neither is more real. People perceive cuddling as nurturant, but experience it as nurturant and erotic. And we can actually use testosterone to parse intimacies, to give us an idea of how these intimacies might overlap and diverge. And we can think about these sort of tricky behavioral contexts like cuddling as being really informative for understanding intimacy and sexuality more broadly. In terms of sexual desires, I said we can think about solitary and dyadic. We can think about erotic and nurturant, but also other forms, right? I've broken it up this way, but other people might have other reasons to break it up other ways. This isn't the only way to break it up. We can use testosterone to parse desires the way we did intimacies, and we can know that socialization affects forms of desire. We can remember that queer and diverse sexualities matter when we're interested in queer and diverse sexualities and when we're interested in sexual desire more generally. So we don't need to only say, I'm interested in studying lesbian sexuality to actually study lesbian sexuality, right? We don't need to ghettoize any of our topics. And I hope I've convinced you, which you probably didn't need much convincing, that sexuality is multifaceted, meaning it's not the same one thing in all ways. So to close up, I hope I've helped us think about testosterone beyond masculinity, that we have all sorts of new hypotheses and insights, that feminist science gives us a better understanding of testosterone, and that thinking of sexuality as multifaceted actually reflects the real world. And that social neuroendocrinology, which is the approach I use, is a really useful way of asking hormonal questions that have social construction and evolution in their answers and get us a lot further by asking both of those at the same time. So I want to thank you so much. And I'm not sure how much time we have for questions because we had a lot of questions in the middle. But thank you so much for your attention, and we'll see about questions. What do you think? Okay.
Just found out that there's another.
Oh, okay. Be out by 5:30. Oh, okay. 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 Actually, I didn't do as bad. I thought it was later. I can't read the time. Yeah. It's a,
I know I speak on behalf of many other women, but it's interesting, fascinating, because testosterone.
no, it's a great question.
So I'm just curious, is that something that's changed?
Well, so all sorts of things do change at menopause, including testosterone. But estradiol is definitely the thing that changes the most. I've done some research, and we do find correlations between estradiol and desire. One of the interesting things is it seems like estradiol is correlated in general with sort of all forms of desire, like with both nurturance and eroticism, which is why I don't study it as much, because I'm really interested in being able to like parse the two with testosterone, because it shows opposite. The other thing I'll say is that from what I understand, a lot of the associations between estradiol and sexuality outside what I just said have to do with what people might call like the mechanics, so like vaginal lubrication, things like that. So more bodily changes. At the same time, that sort of also overlaps some pre-theory that women's hormones have more to do with sort of female reproductive physicality, the more mechanics. Testosterone has more to do with the sort of like abstract thinking brain part. So I'm not entirely sure, but that we have a full story yet and a really nuanced story in the same way I think we're getting to with testosterone. But yeah, so that's what I can tell you. I'm going to go look back and forth.
Yes, two questions. The first is, what are the factors associated with masturbation? Because the obvious precursor is And the second question is you're showing that testosterone is not really the thing to measure. Have any clue as what should be measured, other than this very broad, multi-factor?
Well, I guess it depends on what your goal is, right? So for me, because I'm interested in testosterone and desire, for women, I'm interested in even the small role testosterone seems to have. If you're interested in improving women's problems with desire, testosterone doesn't seem to be the thing to study. And instead, things like masturbation, relationship to your body, the relationship a woman might have, especially if she has a male partner, those seem like the really key things to be looking at. So I think a lot of the things that sex therapists and sex educators already care a lot about, right? So that's your question 2. And question 1 had to do with, it's gone.
What affects
yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the things with the qualitative data that we are kind of understanding is that, first of all, socialization is affecting women's masturbation rates, right? So women are not masturbating some women, because they feel like they can't do it because their pleasure should be their partner's property. Like it's a function of their partner. We also know that women report pretty negative feelings on average about their vulvas and vaginas, suggesting, again, a pretty fraught relationship with solitary sexuality or manual sexuality. So my research isn't so much about explaining masturbation per se, but I can tell you that even from the research I've done, which hasn't been about that those are some of the variables we found influencing differences in masturbation. And as I sometimes say, I don't think we have women in the locker room being like, yeah, I jerked off like 10 times yesterday, right? And the way you might have men, which is also a performative thing, and though we can totally laugh, which is why I'm saying it, is very performative and not necessarily reflecting reality. At the same time, women are also taught, right, we have things like slut shaming, to not feel comfortable about sexuality. So we know that women's relationship to masturbation, to their vulvas, to orgasms, are qualitatively different than men's relationship to their penises, to masturbation, and the cultural narrative around that. So I'm going to move on, but we can talk during the after part. Yes?
I was wondering if there are any studies on prescribing masturbation as a way to increase women?
Well, I feel like you all would know that better than me. So, like I said, I actually study sort of healthy women and men and gender diverse people, and one of the reasons is that so much sex research is on people who have clinical issues for good reason, right? Because the people come, I mean, that's why you're here, right? People have a lot of sexual issues. But that means we often get a bit of a skewed view empirically on what sexuality looks like in the population. So I'm one of the few people who studies healthy individuals. I would imagine there is. I mean, that seems like a pretty common sex therapy thing, but I don't know. So I hope you learn that, and then you can tell me. And send me the studies, too. No, you had your hand up first. I'm sorry.
Oxytocin is sometimes called the enrichment hormone.
That's a great question as well. I don't, because we can only measure it through blood right now, and I just don't think my research is that important to take people's blood, to be honest. But I do some theories. So that's why it's called the steroid peptide theory of social bonds. I didn't tell you about the peptide part today because I wanted to keep it about testosterone, but that's a whole big part of it. Oxytocin is a peptide hormone. I also have a paper, for anyone who's interested in oxytocin as a love hormone, and all my papers are on academia.edu. You can log in and download them for free, but don't tell anyone. I have a paper called Beyond Oxytocin = Good. Because there's a lot of research showing, for example, oxytocin promotes close feelings for in-group, but it increases sort of bad feelings for out-group. So one of the things we're like, oxytocin could be the racism hormone. It could be the hate hormone. Also, if you think about it, oxytocin is thought of as like this trust and love hormone. But do we really need to be trusting and loving everyone? Right? Like, trust is not uniformly good. Love is not uniformly good. So in that paper, I give a much more nuanced view of the problematics, especially for sexuality research, of sort of uniformly lauding oxytocin. But that story is missing from most of what we hear in the media, and to some extent, science. Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest stimulation.
Yeah, for sure, and forgetting of painful events, which sounds really good for birth. Yeah, so oxytocin is also, it increases upon skin-to-skin contact. It's involved in milk letdown and breastfeeding. That's why people call it the love hormone, because it has all these good effects. But when we think about I think it's basically uniformly good to feel bonded with your infant. We would agree, I think. But whether it's uniformly good to feel close and bonded to a partner is not always clear, right? If you have a partner who's abusive, but you, right. But that's not always good. So what I'm saying is that we hear a lot about the good parts of oxytocin, and I'm not disagreeing with those, but I think we need a more complex picture of when feeling close, bonded, trusting is actually not good, right? For an infant, it is. Yes?
I think I just kind of had an example in my head to see if this is what you're meaning. Like if someone is in an abusive relationship, and after that abusive cycle ends and the honeymoon phase comes around, they
Right.
come and start rubbing their shoulders, are you saying like the brain might produce oxytocin and say this feels good, but in the psychosocial context, it's not, it's really, really important?
So that's an example, and no one's done that study, but that's a way to think about how feeling close to someone might actually not be great, right? Or feeling trusting of someone, you go home with them, sometimes that's awesome, and sometimes that wasn't, the thing to do. And one more? One more question? Okay. It's a good question. What we actually found, we did ask about orgasm. And in this study, we also had men, but they all orgasmed, so we couldn't separate it out. But not all women did. And, oh no, I'm thinking of the penis-vagina intercourse. In that, all the men orgasmed, but in the women who orgasmed with penis-vagina intercourse, it seemed like a bigger testosterone increase, but we're not 100% sure. In the masturbation, I think we asked separately about orgasms, but maybe not actually. I think we just asked about masturbation.
And did you control for the means of masturbating, like pornography usage?
It's a great question. So we actually started asking more about pornography usage in the past few years. We weren't asking a huge amount about it. So when people would say, well, what do you mean by solitary desire? I'd say things like, well, it could be desire to look at pornography, desire to masturbate, but we actually weren't always measuring pornography. And the SDI, that Sexual Desire Inventory, doesn't ask about pornography. So we have a study that is just under re-review that hopefully will be coming out about effects of watching porn on testosterone in women, looking at also feelings of autonomy and your choice in what you view, and it turns out feelings of discomfort actually come up a lot too. But so yeah, we're starting to look at that, and we hadn't really looked at that very much there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.